Hello everybody, and welcome back to another drawing video. This video is going to be about a comic book page. I haven't done one of those in a while. This page is going to be a little bit different. Mostly I lay out my comic book pages in a pretty holistic manner where I'm balancing images and text and development of the narrative in an equally balanced way. This page is one of two pages that are almost entirely a monologue. So the most important part of the page is going to be just how that text flows across the page and how does it read. So I've put the text in first, and then I'm building the visuals around that. And typically, if this were a storyboard for a film, I would probably lay the page out as almost like talking heads, like there's just the camera switching back and forth between the people who are in the conversation or in the monologue. But it would be in cinema, that would be very accepted, and in fact in comics, that's, if you look at the visual breakdown of a comic book page where there's a conversation taking place, a lot of times it'll be that sort of talking heads layout where you're just looking at the face of each character as they're saying their bit. In this case, I'm kind of changing things up a little bit, and I'm going to be putting in a more of a camera zoom sequence that is overlaid by the monologue. So the shot is starting out in a prison where the prison guard is looking in through the door of the prison cell and giving this monologue, essentially telling the prisoner why she's there. And then the camera in the middle panel is zooming out. So now we're outside of the window of this prison cell, and you're starting to see the wall and some parts of the other buildings where the prison is located. And then in the last panel, the camera has zoomed out quite a bit, and we're seeing parts of the city where this prison cell is located. So I've laid in my general idea of color balance. So the composition is pretty close to being resolved at this point. I have like how I want the lights and shadows to play and the color families. And what I'm doing now is just starting to put a little bit of texture in there. And I know that there's a whole bunch of buildings there in the two panels to the right. So I'm just putting kind of building-like photo reference in there, just to remind my eye, to sort of get my eye excited about these architectural-looking things. But I'm pasting these on a separate layer, and then I'm setting the blend mode to soft light and immediately dropping that layer so that texture is very ambiguous, but it just looks kind of architectural as opposed to, let's say, a rock texture or a wood texture. There's some quality of architecture there. That's all I'm going for at this point. It's just a quality of light and a quality of texture, and there's still definitely a lot of noodling of the composition, like those on the rightmost panel. I took some of those cliffs away. It was getting a little bit too claustrophobic in there, and also I really wanted to reinforce the sense of a camera zoom of like the middle panel is part of that wall, and then the rightmost panel is a lot more of that wall, and it's really receding, so that I want the geometry to look quite similar. And some of that architectural texture is now being allowed to show through a little bit. Like I like some of those buildings. I think one building was from Spain and another building that I referenced was from Nepal. And I kind of like those colorful prayer flags that are showing up in there, just to give a little sense of color and more importantly to give a sense of life. Like if you draw a whole cluster of buildings like that, and this can happen sometimes in concept art, you can draw a really beautiful city, but how's the viewer to know that it isn't abandoned? So I want some signs of life in there, right? Those little flags flapping in the wind are just a little quick indication that there's some sort of activity going on rather than just kind of these empty shells of houses. And I'm as with my usual workflow, I'm starting to paint over those textures with a textured brush, which is sort of like a rake-shaped brush that just makes some parallel lines and just keeps a sense of texture, but just more gestural strokes. And I'm really just staying in the mentality of establishing color and light balance. I've already determined that a lot of the building details are going to be done in 3D, so there's no need to really get very specific about what those buildings look like. I just want that sort of block of texture to read in a dramatic way. And what I've done so far is just thrown some very big loose blobs of color around in a very organic way, just like playing in a mud box. And now I've returned to what is more kind of a traditional comic book drawing style or workflow, which is essentially like a Renaissance painting workflow, which is laying out shapes with pencil and then inking it and then coloring it. The figures are going to be a lot more specific, so I can't, obviously everyone knows what humans or humanoids look like, so it's harder to just sort of mush around a bunch of random colors and hope that a face comes out of it. It needs a little bit more pre-planning. So that's what I'm doing there. I'm just drawing my layout on another layer that's just opaque but set to a normal blend mode set to lower opacity, just so I can see how those forms are laying on top of the entire composition. And just as a small detail, the comic book is sort of a science fiction fantasy kind of genre, so the figures are actually, they're sort of humanoids that are kind of like centaurs or half beasts. So that's why that guy in the background looks like he has tiny little legs, because they're actually they're like animal legs. Just to clarify why that guy looks sort of like a strange silhouette. But I'm going to skip some of the kind of finer noodling of this stuff because it shows up in other videos anyway. But again, I'm just laying out how I want the light and shadow to play, and then I'm going to clean all that stuff up in the coloring pass. And I'm adding her hand on the windowsill there, but I think I take it away because that would make the camera zoom very complicated, like how to incorporate those bars on the window in the first panel, and then like does the camera magically teleport through the bars in the window. So I just left that whole thing out and just made it more of a simple composition. So here you can see I've I've built all those buildings in Blender. I'm not going to go through the whole process of how I constructed those buildings because there are a lot of 3D modeling tutorials out on YouTube that are a lot more comprehensive than this one. So I just skipped ahead. I built all those buildings. Their texture is a neutral gray color. All I care about for the purposes of this drawing is the light and shadow and the structure. I'm not getting into all the materials and textures and stuff. I'm going to do all that by hand. The only thing I am going to do is I'm going to add some environmental light. So what I'm doing here is I'm going into the shader nodes for the world shader, and I'm going to add some global illumination. I'm going to map an HDR image onto my global illumination solution in Cycles Render. At this point in history, pretty much if you're doing 3D rendering, you're going to be using a lot of HDR shaders and or HDR format images rather, and I'm not going to really go into the theory behind that because again that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But you know, this city is sitting in a canyon in a desert, so I've selected an HDR image that kind of has a desert canyon color balance to it, and I'm just going to render my scene. You can see I've got more oranges and blues reflecting into the model from that environment shader. But other than that, I'm not going to go into any texturing on this model. I think there is a texture for some of the window frames, but again, it's just showing up as a black and white kind of, essentially kind of like a normal map. But anything else, I really care more about the atmosphere and the overall texture of these buildings. The purpose of the comic book page is to reinforce where the characters are. The reader already knows where the story is taking place, but it's good to just show a few reinforcement shots to just sort of give more information about this city that's built into the side of a cliff where the story is taking place. So I've skipped ahead now. I've rendered those forms out. They're just gray, and now it's going to be a process of blending those basic textures into the environment of the page. And I've started to take that same rake brush and also my palette knife brush, which is essentially just a very thin line that I use to create strokes, and I'm going into those rendered buildings and either painting on top of them or extending the geometry. I want to avoid a very pristine, mathematically perfect rendering of those buildings. I'm going to essentially go in there and add human gesture and a more interpretive gesture into the geometry of the buildings. And even though the lighting setup in Blender is technically similar to the way that I've set up the light in my original layout, it's not nearly dramatic enough. So I'm going in a lot with my brush set to screen blend mode or even color dodge blend mode, and I'm just adding a lot more chaos and a lot more gesture into that rendering, like right on top of it. I don't care if some of the detail gets covered with scribbles. It's all about creating a texture or a mood. And the other thing that is very important is I've made a copy of my initial layout layer, that initial color and light layout. I've made a copy of it, I've pasted it on top of my gray buildings, and then I set the blend mode to not to overlay soft light. I set it to soft light, so those initial chaotic scribbles from the very beginning are now used to colorize those gray forms of the buildings, and that initial very raw texture starts to add another kind of glaze of activity on top of those very harsh computer renderings, because I'm not interested in creating a highly accurate rendering where everyone, where you can see every windowsill and every doorknob. I really still want to create just the impression of a particular architecture, and I want that to read as a mood. It's all about art directing the flavor or the quality of that shot. It's not about being a diagram about how those buildings are built. So I'm constantly going in there and using the color dodge brush to just make those kind of shafts of sunlight that are kissing the buildings and making them even more intense and even more striking. Definitely more striking than they would be in real life, but not too far away from what you'd expect to see in a movie of this genre. Everything needs to be a little bit more exaggerated. And I went ahead and created all of the dialogue bubbles of the text and put those in just so that I can make sure that I'm not drawing some really involved bit of art and then discover that it just gets covered up by a voice balloon anyway. I want to keep those dialogue bubbles in place, but I turned the words off because actually generating all that text takes a heavy load on the processor, so it starts to slow down my computer if all those words are up there. So I turned the words off just so that my brushes can stay a little bit more responsive. I've gone back into Blender now. I want that rooftop that appears at the bottom of the middle frame to be to match the style of the buildings above it. I was starting to make that rooftop just with hand gestures, but it was just with Photoshop brushes, but it was looking a little sloppy. So I'm going to just create quickly a rendering just of that rooftop, and I'm sort of not positioning it in a way that makes sense architecturally. I just want a shape at the right position within the frame. And also I'm just going to move that rooftop to a different layer in Blender so that I can just render that out by itself. There's no reason to also render all those buildings since I already have those, and I locked that camera into place so I can just go back to the camera where I did the previous rendering and isolate just that part of the model and render that part of the model from exactly the same viewpoint. And so I'm just doing a quick preview render it out, and then dropping it in down there. The same workflow applies here. I'm just going to make a copy of that sloppy color gesture layer, paste it on top of the rendering, set the blend mode to soft light, and then just kind of fiddle around with the settings so that there's clearly a sense of that 3D render, but there's also enough gesture and chaos showing through to create a comfortable blend between that very gestural rendering style and the more hard-edged rendering style. And if I had infinite time and infinite resources, I would love to paint that whole city by hand and put every detail into place, but that would take forever. So that's the only reason I'm using the 3D. It just saves me a lot of time. The problem with the 3D being that it looks computer generated, because that's what it is. So I don't want that really harsh digital synthetic look. I want a much more warm and human look. So I have to figure out methodologies for adding gestural qualities to a digital synthetic subject, and I do that mostly just by painting on top of my renderings and sort of dirtying them up with a lot of brushes set to partial opacity. Here I've skipped ahead a bit. I did the inking on that figure. I didn't record that kind of process of noodling all of those ink lines in there, because that process has been kind of elucidated in other videos before, so that I'm not going to bore you with all of that noodling. But now I'm doing kind of similar to what I did with those buildings. I'm just laying in the very big map of where I want colors, where I want light and shadow and color to fall. And for me, like, the figure is already 90% done here. I care about where the light falls and the color balance, and then I can always go in and clean it up. But and again, here I used the same technique. I copied that underlying really raw first impression, and I pasted it on top of the figure and set the blend mode probably to overlay or something, to just reintroduce some of that very raw first impression kind of brushwork, to just keep it looking fresh. Like, otherwise that initial color layout that I did with a hard edge brush is just going to look too kind of pristine, and I want just all of these unpredictable plays of light and shadow and color to be there to keep the rendering looking exciting and looking alive. And now it's just a question of kind of noodling that stuff, kind of keeping some of those lights keeping some of the edges of those lights quite crisp, and other ones getting nicely blurred and blended, and just hitting a few highlights. And I touch the rendering in some areas just very lightly with a brush set to color dodge, especially right where the light and shadow turns, just to add a little bit of extra saturation right at the edge of the shadows, which is typically where you see the most hue and color saturation happening on an object. And the figure in the background, I'm going to keep scarcely more than a silhouette. I'm just going to add a little bit of color information, but I want him to recede way into the background, and there's no reason to add a lot of information about what that guy looks like, because that character has already been established on a previous page, so the viewer kind of knows who that is. But for this page, it's much more important to to have that character as like this vaguely threatening silhouette in the background. And if I got really into rendering out all his costume and accessories and all that, then that would become like a significant element of the page. And I just want this threatening figure in the background to be just very atmospheric. So I'm not going to clean that up very much more than what I have here. All right, I skipped a bit ahead. I'm not going to record all of the tiny little noodling activities. Again, I'm just going back into making some very big decisions, adding some more haze and atmosphere into the overall scene to just reinforce the strength of those shafts of light that are coming across the buildings, and also the glow from the prison cell door, just creating more atmosphere, less detail. The original reference image that I used had these sort of Nepalese prayer flags, which I liked, but I'm gonna create some of my own so that they make more sense within the drawing. And what I'm doing there is I'm creating a custom brush with that square flag-like shape, changing the spacing of the brush, and changing like adding randomized colors to that. So now I can just sort of drag across the canvas and create some little flag-like streamers, and then just distort them as needed. Just like a few little final touches. This is pretty much the end of the painting process. And again, I've skipped ahead here. I've added a little bit more noodling to the figure. I've added a bunch of streamers of those flags that just sort of, one, give an indication that there's like a breeze blowing through the place, and two, giving just an indication that there's like some life here, like somebody hung those flags there, and just adding like a little bit of small activity here and there. But that's the page there, and I've turned the text back on, and it's pretty much ready to post. So I hope this video was informative, and maybe you got a few insights or tips or inspirations, and I'll see you around next time. All right, bye.